Plain text, December 18th, 1944. At 0647 hours, the Ardennes forest is no longer a sanctuary of ancient trees and mountain silence. It has been transformed into a frozen, gray laboratory of industrial-scale attrition, where the very atmosphere seems to have crystallized into a state of suspended animation, waiting for a violent punctuation that will rewrite the laws of survival. Sergeant Jim Morrison, a 23-year-old soul whose youth has been systematically eroded by 31 hours of sleepless vigilance and the biting, parasitic cold of a Belgian winter, crouches in a foxhole near Bastogne, feeling the sub-zero air turn his every breath into a blinding, rhythmic shroud of white vapor that hangs in the air like a ghost. The temperature sits at a stagnant 15 degrees, a frost so deep it seeks out the microscopic gaps in his wool coat and turns the oil in his rifle into a sluggish, useless paste. Yet it is not the shivering of his muscles that haunts him. It is the low-frequency vibration beginning to radiate through the frozen earth, a rhythmic, metallic thrumming that signals the approach of a 45-ton predator. Through the shifting curtains of the morning fog, the nightmare of every American infantryman begins to take a jagged physical form. The angular, intimidating profile of a German Tiger tank, a beast of Krupp steel that for years has enjoyed a total structural imbalance over the battlefields of Europe. Since the bloody hedgerows of Normandy, American soldiers have lived under the suffocating shadow of Panzer Paralysis, a psychological trauma born from the realization that their standard-issue weapons were little more than toys against the sloped, reinforced carapaces of the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads. But today, in this particular patch of frozen mud, Morrison is holding a secret that the generals and scientists at Aberdeen Proving Ground promised would defy the very laws of gravity and metallurgy. He grips the cold, olive-drab tube of his M6A3 Bazooka, a weapon that didn't exist in the tactical manuals 4 years ago, now loaded with an anomaly that the Germans haven't yet calculated for in their grand Ardennes offensive. Inside the warhead of the M6A3 rocket resting across his shoulder sits a precisely machined cone of pure copper, material recycled from the very pennies that once sat in the pockets of American citizens in Des Moines and Springfield, now repurposed into a tool of hypersonic violence that bridges the existential gap between a 3-pound tube and 45 tons of invincible engineering. The Tiger's engine produces a distinctive guttural Maybach growl that Morrison has learned to identify in his nightmares, a sound that vibrates the very marrow of his bones and tells him that the gods of Krupp steel are coming to claim their tithe of American lives. He can see the spare track links hanging from the Tiger's turret sides like iron scales, and the rough, jagged ridges of Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste applied across the hull, glinting through the mist, like the skin of a prehistoric beast that has survived into the modern age. The tank commander is exposed in the cupola, scanning the tree line with the professional arrogance of a man who knows that nothing in an American soldier's pack can scratch his paint, unaware that he is staring into the eyes of a boy who has been pushed past the point of fear into a state of cold, predatory clarity. Morrison's internal monologue is a frantic, overlapping calculation of range, deflection, and the sheer audacity of the Monroe Effect. The manual says 70 yards is the kill zone, but the manual was written by men in warm offices who never saw a rocket bounce off a Panther's glacis plate like a pebble thrown against a mountain cliff. He remembers the engagements where Charlie Company was liquidated because they lacked the variable to solve the German equation. But the M6A3 is not a conventional explosive. It is a miracle of fluid dynamics designed to harness the Monroe Effect, a bolt of synthetic lightning trapped in a copper cone that is about to disrupt the zone of immunity. As the Tiger designated number 412 begins to traverse its massive 88mm gun toward the tree line where his brothers are dug in, Morrison realizes he has exactly 20 seconds to prove the scientists right or die proving them wrong in the heavy silence of the Belgian woods. The ground continues to tremble. A tectonic shift caused by the grinding of steel tracks on frozen earth, and Morrison can feel the heat of the Tiger's exhaust beginning to mingle with the freezing fog, a chemical scent of oil and war that stains the air. He flips off the safety, the mechanical click sounding like a thunderclap in his ears, a finality that cuts through the rumble of the approaching beast and signals the end of the syndrome of helplessness. His loader, Private Eddie Kowalski, a Detroit native who understands machines better than he understands men, taps his helmet. A silent, sacred signal of readiness between two soldiers who expect to be erased from the earth within the minute if the physics fail. Morrison aligns his sights not on the thick, intimidating frontal plate, but on the delicate geometry where the turret meets the hull, the turret ring, the anatomical weak point where the invincibility of Krupp steel is thinnest and the hypersonic jet can do the most catastrophic damage. The Tiger rolls forward another 3 yards, its tracks crushing a frozen fence with a sound like breaking bones, its presence an inevitable force of nature that seems to swallow the very light of the morning. At 68 yards, the point of no return, Morrison squeezes the trigger with a steady, deliberate pressure that defies the 31 hours of exhaustion and the 15-degree air. There is no cinematic Hollywood whoosh that fills the air with theatrical flair. There is only a sharp, violent, and realistic mechanical crack as the rocket motor ignites, sending a sudden hot backblast of scorched snow and burnt ozone out the rear of the tube, creating a temporary vacuum in the foxhole. He watches the trajectory for a half-second that feels like an eternity, the M6A3 rocket cutting through the fog like a lethal fin-stabilized dart of destiny, its fins snapping open to stabilize its path against the winter wind. Impact occurs with the precision of a surgeon's blade. There is no massive fireball to flip the tank, no dramatic explosion to satisfy a propaganda reel. Instead, there is only a tiny, sterile white flash, a strobe light burst of pure energy that looks like a camera bulb going off in the dark Ardennes mist, a visual signature of the Monroe miracle. In that single blinding microsecond, the structural imbalance of the war is corrected through the power of hyperplastic deformation. The copper cone inside the warhead, subjected to 3 million pounds of pressure per square inch, transforms into a hypersonic jet of solid particles traveling at 25,000 feet per second. This jet does not melt the armor. It ignores the very concept of solidity, boring through 4 inches of hardened steel in 0.00004 seconds. The invincibility of the Third Reich is punctured by a hole the size of a quarter, and inside the Tiger, the atmosphere is instantly transformed into a vortex of molten spall and hypersonic fragments, a process of total internal liquidation that leaves no room for screams or regrets. For a heartbeat, the tank sits perfectly still, its Maybach engine still producing its guttural rumble, its turret frozen mid-traverse, as if the machine hasn't yet realized its heart has been incinerated by the fury of American science. Then, a thin, oily stream of black smoke begins to curl from the commander's cupola, followed by the first orange licks of a secondary fire that signals the end of the god of war and the beginning of a new era of infantry dominance. Morrison sits back in his foxhole, the smell of cordite and copper heavy in his lungs, watching the 45-ton beast turn into a hollow metal coffin, realizing that the anomaly has finally rewritten the book of survival. The silence that follows is heavier than the rumble ever was, an eerie, terrifying quiet that tells the remaining German tanks that the hunter is no longer a machine, but the man in the mud with the red-banded rocket. This is the day the Tiger learned to fear the foxhole, the day the meat grinder found something it couldn't digest, and for Jim Morrison, the 31 hours of sleeplessness are finally replaced by the cold, hard logic of the Panzer Mörder, a legacy written in recycled pennies, and a 60-microsecond flash of synthetic lightning. Plain text. By the cold, bleak midpoint of 1944, the American infantryman in the European theater of operations had developed a collective, haunting realization that the weapons hanging from his shoulders were fundamentally obsolete against the steel reality of the Third Reich's armored evolution, a realization that manifested as a profound psychological and tactical state known as Panzer Paralysis. This was not merely a failure of courage or a lack of training. It was the chilling, systemic byproduct of a structural imbalance, where the infantryman lived in a condition of existential dread, knowing that the appearance of a single German tank meant a death sentence for his entire squad because the physics of his current arsenal had been outpaced by Krupp engineering. The tragedy of the Ardennes, in December 1944, was the final bloody climax of a technological gap that had been widening since the invasion of Sicily, where the official doctrine of the United States Army, which insisted that the infantry was the flexible queen of battle, capable of holding any ground, collapsed the moment the low-frequency rumble of a Maybach engine vibrated through the frozen mud. The standard issue M1 Bazooka, once hailed as a revolutionary handheld cannon, had become a source of bitter irony among the men who were forced to carry it into the meat grinder of the front lines. Its early 2.36-inch M6A1 rocket was designed to penetrate 80 millimeters of vertical armor under laboratory conditions. But the battlefield was not a laboratory, and the German panzer units had moved far beyond the flat-plated designs of the early war. By the time of the Bulge, the Wehrmacht was fielding the Panther and the Tiger, monsters of steel defined by steep, 60-degree slopes and face-hardened armor that reached thicknesses of 100 to 120 millimeters, creating what tankers and infantry alike called the zone of immunity. To a soldier in a foxhole, the Panther was not just a machine, it was a god of war that occupied a space where American fire simply ceased to exist as a threat. The statistics from the fall of 1944 provide a brutal ledger of this failure. In 1,347 separate engagements across the Western Front, American infantry units encountered German armor without the support of their own Shermans or tank destroyers, and in 892 of those encounters, nearly 66% of the time, the American units suffered casualty rates exceeding 40%. These were not battles in any traditional sense. They were liquidations where the infantryman froze in a state of Panzer Paralysis because he knew that his best effort, a perfect shot from the suicidal range of 50 yards, would simply result in the bounce. He would watch the bazooka rocket strike the glacis plate of a Panther and explode harmlessly like a pebble thrown against a mountain. The dull, ineffective thud of the detonation followed immediately by the mechanical scream of the German turret traversing toward his position to erase him from the earth. This structural imbalance created a tactical nightmare in the Ardennes, where narrow, winding roads and dense forests made the deployment of American armor nearly impossible, leaving the infantry to face armored spearheads that had been engineered to be unkillable by portable means. The fear was not just of the 88mm gun. It was the psychological trauma of being hunted by an enemy you cannot hurt. A soul-crushing kind of violence that creates a freeze response in even the most seasoned veterans who had survived the beaches of Normandy only to find themselves obsolete in the snow of Belgium. They saw their brothers in arms incinerated in their foxholes, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because the military machine had failed to provide them with the teeth required to pierce the hide of the beast. The meat grinder was hungry, and until the Monroe Effect could be successfully married to a portable rocket system, the American infantry was merely the fuel for a German breakthrough that threatened to split the Allied lines and seize the vital port of Antwerp. The 1,347 engagements recorded in the official archives are more than just numbers. They are a record of 1,347 moments where hope was replaced by the cold, hard realization of obsolescence, a period where the Third Reich's armor laughed at American innovation. The infantrymen felt the syndrome of helplessness intensify with every engine roar in the mist, turning seasoned fighters into ghosts who simply waited for the inevitable because they lacked a variable that could disrupt the German equation of dominance. They were men standing in the path of an industrial-scale predator, armed with weapons that were a polite suggestion rather than a deterrent. And as the casualty reports mounted, the urgency for a solution became existential. This was the era of the zone of immunity, a terrifying gap between the bazooka's impact and the tank's invulnerability, where the American soldier learned the true meaning of attrition, watching his squad disappear into the smoke of a battle they were never equipped to win. And it was in this gap that the very soul of the army was being tested against the cold, unyielding face of German steel. The need for the M6A3 rocket was not just a technical requirement for the Ordnance Department. It was a desperate psychological necessity to restore the balance of power and give the man in the foxhole a reason to believe that he could finally turn the hunter into the hunted before the entire front collapsed under the weight of the Panzer spearheads. Every time a Sherman tank was knocked out, leaving the ground troops exposed, the fear grew that the war would be lost not by a lack of soldiers, but by a lack of a single, lethal innovation that could reach through the armor and touch the heart of the machine. The soldiers knew that courage was no longer enough. They needed a miracle of physics to break the Panzer Paralysis and give them a fighting chance against a monster that had been designed to be the end of their world. And without that change, the Ardennes would become nothing more than a permanent frozen graveyard for the Western Allies, who had come so far only to be it, and by the sheer thickness of a German steel plate. This was the crisis of 1944, a battle against a structural imbalance that had turned the infantryman into a bystander in his own war, waiting for a weapon that could finally shred the manual and replace the syndrome of helplessness with the cold, predatory clarity of a survivor who refuses to die by the book. Plain text, the miracle that saved the American infantry from the crushing weight of the Third Reich's armored superiority was not forged in the heat of a heroic charge or the tactical brilliance of a high-ranking general, but rather in the sterile, obsessive silence of the ballistics laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where scientists and engineers sought to weaponize a ghost from the late 19th century, a phenomenon that had sat dormant in academic textbooks for over 50 years. To understand why Sergeant Morrison's 3-pound rocket could achieve what a massive anti-tank gun often failed to do, one must look deep into the hidden history of the Monroe Effect, discovered almost by accident in 1888, when American chemist Charles E. Monroe noticed that high explosives with hollowed-out cavities did not just explode outward in a chaotic blast, but focused their fury into a singular, devastating point of concentrated energy. This was the birth of the shaped charge, a concept of directional explosives that remained a laboratory curiosity until Swiss scientist Henry Mohalep refined the physics in 1938. Transforming a crude explosion into a surgical tool of hypersonic liquidation that would eventually bridge the existential gap between the man in the mud and the beast of Krupp steel. By 1944, the United States Army realized that the traditional rules of kinetic energy, where a shell's power was determined strictly by its weight and the velocity of the gun that fired it, had reached a dead end against the evolving armor of the Wehrmacht. The M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank round, or HEAT, represented a fundamental shift in the geometry of death, moving away from brute force and toward the elegant, terrifying application of fluid dynamics and chemical energy. At the heart of this weapon sat a precisely machined cone of pure copper, a material chosen not for its hardness, but for its specific density and ductility. The engineering required to create this cone was a feat of absolute precision that defied the industrial standards of the era. The copper had to be machined to a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch, as any microscopic imperfection in the liner would cause the resulting jet to disperse and fail, turning a lethal strike into a harmless spark. Engineers tested 73 different variations of the cone's geometry before settling on a 42-degree angle as the mathematical sweet spot required to collapse the metal into a stable, penetrating jet. However, the production of these precision liners faced a catastrophic logistical bottleneck, a nationwide shortage of copper in 1943 and 44 that threatened to stall the entire anti-tank program just as the panzers were becoming more invincible. The solution was as desperate as it was symbolic. The United States government began an intensive recycling program, pulling millions of pre-1943 copper pennies from circulation and melting them down to fuel the production lines of the Panzer Mörder. Each M6A3 warhead required approximately 0.8 pounds of pure copper, a physical investment of roughly 80 American pennies to kill a German Tiger. This was the Penny War, a conflict where the humble currency of the American public was repurposed into a tool of total war. To truly clear the AI slop of popular history, it must be stated with scientific clarity. The M6A3 does not melt through armor. It is not a plasma torch or a stream of superheated gas in the traditional sense. Instead, when the composition be explosive, a lethal high-velocity mixture of RDX and TNT detonates behind the copper cone, it produces a shockwave moving at 26,000 feet per second. This shockwave subjects the copper liner to pressures exceeding 3 million pounds per square inch, a force 3 times greater than the weight of the entire ocean at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Under this localized, cosmic-level pressure, the copper undergoes a process called hyperplastic deformation, behaving like a solid metal, and begins to flow like a hyperdense liquid, despite remaining technically below its melting point. This hypersonic jet of copper particles travels at 25,000 feet per second, so fast it crosses the standoff distance and bores through 4 inches of face-hardened Krupp steel in 0.000006 seconds. The jet does not burn a hole. It outpressures the armor, creating a plastic extrusion where the steel is simply pushed aside as if it were soft butter. The sheer kinetic energy of this jet is so great that it sends a cone of lethal spall, fragments of the tank's own interior armor, shredding through the crew compartment at supersonic speeds, ensuring that anyone inside the steel box is liquidated instantly. This was the Monroe Miracle, the moment where American innovation turned a common material into a bolt of synthetic lightning that could ignore the zone of immunity enjoyed by German panzers for years. The engineering of the M6A3 also required a solution to the problem of standoff distance. For the copper jet to form its long, needle-like shape correctly, the warhead had to detonate exactly 4.7 inches away from the target's surface. This was achieved by the fragile, hollow steel nose cone, a component so sensitive that infantrymen were warned never to dent or muffle it, for a single imperfection could disrupt the jet's formation and turn a lethal strike into a useless dud. Because the bazooka was a smoothbore weapon, the M6A3 rocket relied on tail fins rather than rifling for stabilization, allowing it to fly straight without the centrifugal force of a spinning shell that would otherwise cause the copper jet to scatter and lose its penetrating power. This was a victory of the laboratory over the factory, a testament to the power of a single, focused scientific idea to shatter the armored invincibility of an empire. The transition from Panzer Paralysis to the offensive dominance of the Panzer Mörder was not merely a change in tactics. It was a rewrite of the laws of matter on the battlefield. As the first shipments of these red-banded rockets reached the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, the American infantryman ceased to be a victim of a structural imbalance and became a wielder of a hypersonic scalpel. The experts in Washington finally understood what the man in the foxhole had always known, that in a machine-driven conflict, the only way to kill a monster is to find the mathematical flaw in its skin. The M6A3 was that flaw, a weapon that proved that in the chaos of total war, the most dangerous technology is the one that gives a desperate man the ability to reach out and touch the heart of an invincible beast with a stream of recycled pennies and the cold, hard logic of the Monroe Effect, effectively turning every American infantryman into a potential tank killer who could stand his ground against the heaviest armor the Third Reich could field. Would you like me to move on to Part 4 and describe the visceral reality of this weapon in combat? Plain text. The Ardennes forest, at 0649 hours, on December 18, 1944, exists in a state of suffocating pre-dawn tension, where the very air seems to have crystallized into a brittle shroud of ice and fog that holds its breath in anticipation of a violent correction to the structural imbalance of the war. Sergeant Jim Morrison, his muscles twitching with the rhythmic tremors of 31 hours of sleep-deprived vigilance and the biting Belgian frost that has turned his wool coat into a rigid armor of ice, stares down the iron sights of his M6A3 bazooka. His world narrowed into a singular, predatory tunnel, where the only reality is the angular, terrifying silhouette of Tiger Tank number 412. As it lumbers through the gray curtains of mist, at a range of exactly 68 yards. This Tiger is not just a machine. It is a 45-ton god of war, its hull coated in the rough, jagged ridges of Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste, a defensive skin designed to prevent the attachment of magnetic mines, but a measure that Morrison is about to prove utterly irrelevant, with a weapon forged from the humble copper of recycled American pennies and the cold, hard logic of fluid dynamics. This is the moment of the hypersonic scalpel, where 18 months of frantic, desperate laboratory work at Aberdeen Proving Ground are distilled into a 19-inch rocket that looks deceptively simple, but carries the kinetic power to kill a mountain of Krupp steel. The mechanical reality of the M6A3 bazooka is a different beast than the rifles and machine guns Morrison has mastered. It is a smoothbore predator, a tube that launches its projectile with a violent mechanical crack rather than the theatrical whoosh of Hollywood fiction, a sound that signals a definitive end to the German zone of immunity. Because the tube is smooth, the M6A3 rocket does not spin to find its stability like a rifle bullet. Instead, it relies on 6 thin tail fins that snap open with a metallic ring the moment it leaves the barrel, allowing the warhead to cut through the freezing atmosphere with a linear, predatory purpose that keeps the copper liner perfectly aligned for the microsecond of impact. At the tip of this rocket is the critical variable, the lethal anomaly, that defines the difference between a bounce and a kill. The 4.7-inch hollow steel nose cone. This component is the lethal scalpel itself, a standoff mechanism engineered with such sensitivity that it must survive the violent flight through the Ardennes fog, but crumple instantly upon impact to ensure the warhead, at the precise mathematical distance required for the internal copper liner to manifest its fury. If Morrison's rocket strikes even a thin branch or a cluster of tall grass, the nose cone will trigger the explosion too early, and the physics of the Monroe Effect will disperse harmlessly against the air. But Morrison has cleared his firing lane, targeting the turret ring, the anatomical weak point where the turret meets the hull and the Krupp steel is most vulnerable to a vertical jet. He squeezes the trigger with a steady, deliberate pressure that defies the shivering of his frostbitten fingers. The crack of the rocket motor is sharp and sudden, a vacuum-sealing pop that sends a backblast of scorched snow and burnt ozone flying out the rear of the tube, creating a temporary pocket of heat in the freezing foxhole. He watches the trajectory for a half-second that feels like an eternity. The M6A3 rocket cutting through the fog in a blur of motion, its red-banded warhead locked onto the Tiger's turret ring like a guided bolt of synthetic lightning. The impact is not a grand fireball. It is a 0.00004-second event that defines the word liquidation in a way the human mind can barely comprehend. The nose cone strikes the face-hardened armor and collapses, ing the warhead exactly 4.7 inches from the surface, allowing the base detonating fuse to fire. In that microsecond, the Monroe miracle occurs. The solid copper cone, subjected to 3 million pounds of pressure per square inch, undergoes hyperplastic deformation, turning into a needle-thin jet of solid particles traveling at 25,000 feet per second, so fast that it ignores the concept of solidity and bores through 100 millimeters of steel as if it were soft, warm butter. Morrison sees it through the shifting fog. The camera bulb flash, a tiny, blindingly white strobe of pure energy that signals the perforation of the tiger's hide is complete. The jet does not melt the armor. It outpressures it, creating a quarter-sized entry hole that serves as the entry point for the total internal annihilation of the German crew. Inside the tank, the environment is instantly converted into a hellscape of supersonic spall and molten fragments, a lethal cone of secondary destruction that shreds ammunition racks, hydraulic lines, and the human beings operating them in a pulse of heat and light that exceeds the temperature of the sun's surface. The Tiger sits eerily still for a single heartbeat, its Maybach engine still producing a guttural, autonomous rumble, as if the machine hasn't yet realized its soul has been incinerated and its crew liquidated by a stream of recycled pennies. Then, the immense pressure trapped inside the hull finds its exit. The commander's cupola hatch is blown open by the internal overpressure, and a column of thick, oily black smoke begins to billow into the gray Ardennes sky, a visual testament that the Panzer Paralysis has been broken, and the hunter is no longer the machine. The second and third tanks in the German column begin a frantic, uncoordinated reverse maneuver, their commanders retreating in a state of sudden cognitive dissonance, realizing that every foxhole in this forest is now a death sentence. Morrison reloads, his hands moving with a mechanical grace that defies his 31 hours of exhaustion. While Private Kowalski slides the next red-banded rocket into the tube, their eyes meeting in a silent, grim acknowledgement that the math of survival has officially been rewritten. This 60-microsecond event has turned a teenage soldier into a Panzer Mörder, a tank murderer who has seen through the illusion of invincibility and found the mathematical flaw in the heart of the Third Reich's armored dreams. Would you like me to begin writing Part 5, where we explore the wider tactical shockwave this weapon sent through the German High Command? Plain text. By the cold, midnight hour of December 20th, 1944, the rumors echoing across the German radio frequencies had transformed from routine combat reports into a state of structural panic, as the armored spearheads of the Third Reich realized that the Panzer Paralysis they had relied upon for 4 years had finally been broken by an invisible, hypersonic predator. The arrival of the M6A3 red-banded rockets at the front lines of the Ardennes was not just a logistical update. It was a tactical revolution that inverted the hierarchy of the battlefield, turning the American infantryman from a vulnerable victim of armored superiority into a Panzer Mörder, a tank murderer. German commanders, who had once viewed American foxholes as mere nuisances to be crushed under their heavy steel tracks, were now issuing frantic, top-secret warnings to all armored units to avoid close-quarter contact with infantry, and to assume that every shadow in the Belgian fog contained a weapon capable of total internal liquidation. The legacy of the M6A3 was built on a foundation of brutal statistics that defied the military logic of the era. Between December 18th and December 31st, American bazooka teams, using the new HEAT rounds, destroyed or disabled 127 German armored vehicles, including 47 Panzer IVs, 31 Panthers, and 8 legendary Tigers that had previously been considered invincible gods of war. This was a success rate of 68%. A staggering existential leap from the 31% effectiveness of the older M6A1 rockets, proving that for the first time in the conflict, the man in the mud was mathematically favored over the 45-ton beast of Krupp steel. The German response to this Monroe miracle was a mixture of technical adaptation and raw, psychological terror. Armored crews, feeling the syndrome of helplessness shift onto their own shoulders, began welding spare track links, road wheels, and even heavy mud or wooden logs onto their hulls in a desperate attempt to create an improvised standoff barrier, hoping to trigger the copper jet prematurely. They deployed Scherzen, thin metal mesh or solid steel plates hung 6 inches from the hull sides, specifically designed to disrupt the formation of the hypersonic jet before it could contact the main armor. While these countermeasures worked in isolated, lucky incidents, they often failed against the raw, concentrated fury of the M6A3. The copper jet was so stable and traveled at such extreme velocities that it frequently punched through the mesh, crossed the air gap, and still had enough energy to perforate the main hull and incinerate the crew compartment in 0.00004 seconds. This failure of defensive engineering created a state of cognitive dissonance within the Panzerwaffe. The German tanker, who had been taught that his armor was an invincible shield, now lived in a condition of constant shivering alert, assuming that every American soldier holding a tube was an apex predator wielding a lethal anomaly. The Eruth factor and the success of soldiers like Jim Morrison had permeated the entire theater of war, shifting the engagement distances and forcing German tanks to sit back at ranges exceeding 500 yards, where their superior optics could pick off infantry before the 300-yard effective range of the bazooka could be reached. However, this caution cost the Germans their most precious strategic asset: time. Every minute a Tiger spent maneuvering to avoid a suspected bazooka nest was a minute that American artillery and 8th Air Force ground support missions could use to close the trap. The M6A3 had effectively stripped the Panzer of its ability to lead a lightning strike, turning the blitzkrieg into a cautious, paralyzed crawl through a landscape of potential death sentences. This inversion of combat roles was a bitter irony for American tankers as well. While the 75mm rifled guns of their Sherman tanks still struggled to find a killing blow against the thick frontal armor of a Panther, the infantryman in the frozen mud now possessed a lethal scalpel that could achieve a total kill. This led to an unofficial, high-stakes competition among the infantry divisions, a hunt for German metal where squads would actively track and ambush armored patrols, seeking the prestige of a Panzer kill to add to their unit's tally and boost the morale of men who had been pushed to the brink of exhaustion. The logistical machinery behind this success was equally intense. As the demand for M6A3 rounds reached 250,000 per month, the production of precision-machined copper liners became a national priority in the United States, with engineers working around the clock to ensure that the 42-degree angle of the cone remained perfect to within 1,000th of an inch. The fragility of the nose cone became a secondary battlefront. Soldiers were forced to baby their rockets like fragile Christmas ornaments, storing them in their sleeping bags to maintain temperature stability and protect the standoff mechanism from the crushing moisture of the Belgian winter. One infantryman famously wrote home that they were fighting a war with million-dollar machines using weapons they had to transport like eggs. Yet no one complained when the Tiger in front of them turned into a hollowed-out furnace after a single strobe flash of white energy. The psychological impact of the Panzer Mörder legacy exceeded its physical damage. It broke the German soul of invincibility and restored the belief of the American infantryman in his own survival against all odds. It proved that in the cold mathematics of total war, an innovation packed into a 3-pound tube could be more decisive than 1,000 tons of armor plate if it successfully targeted the mathematical flaw in the enemy's design. As the war pushed toward the Rhine, the M6A3 stood as a testament to the power of the lethal anomaly, the moment when a desperate man in a foxhole is given the tools to rewrite the physics of the battlefield and turn a weapon that shouldn't work into a legend that will never be forgotten by those who survived the meat grinder. The hunter was no longer a machine. The hunter was the man who refused to die by the manual, armed with a stream of recycled pennies and the cold, hard logic of the Monroe Effect. This shift in momentum saved the 100th or 101st Airborne at Bastogne, allowing them to hold the line against armored divisions that were now too terrified to close the distance, effectively ending the German hope for a breakthrough and setting the stage for the final collapse of the Third Reich. The M6A3 was the ultimate variable, the straw that broke the tiger's back, and the silent savior of a generation of infantrymen who finally had the teeth to bite back. Would you like me to move on to Part 6 to conclude the story with the legacy of the M6A3 and its impact on the modern battlefield? Plain text. When Sergeant Jim Morrison finally stepped off the troop transport and returned to the black soil of Iowa in November 1945, he did not carry the boisterous pride of a conquering hero, but rather the heavy, leaden silence of a man who had looked into the white-hot flash of industrial liquidation and seen the true face of modern attrition. He moved through the quiet streets of his hometown as a ghost of the Ardennes, a 24-year-old veteran with a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts tucked away in a cigar box, carrying psychological scars that the society of 1945 simply dismissed as combat fatigue or a lack of character, unaware that the meat grinder of Bastogne had fundamentally rewired his soul. Morrison spent the next 37 years working in a meatpacking plant, a brutal irony that was not lost on him as he spent his days surrounded by the clinical, repetitive violence of slaughter, a reflection of the internal liquidation he had inflicted upon the crews of Tiger Tank 412 and the Panther that followed. For decades, he never spoke of the frozen foxholes, the red-banded M6A3 rockets, or the Panzer Mörder legacy that had saved his life but cost him his peace, choosing instead to bury the memory of the young German soldier rolling off the turret deck in a pillar of fire. It wasn't until 1987, during a high school history project for his grandson, that the silence finally shattered, revealing a perspective on war that defied the sanitized propaganda of the history books. Morrison told the boy with a haunting surgical clarity that no one should ever tell him war is glorious, because war is merely the act of killing and then living with the cold, hard logic of what you did to survive. He confessed that while he was eternally grateful for the technology of the Monroe Effect, the miracle of physics that gave a man in the mud the teeth to bite back against a god of steel, he remained forever haunted by the efficiency of that lethal scalpel and the realization that the boys inside those tanks were just as desperate to stay alive as he was. Jim Morrison died in 2003 at the age of 82, and it was only then that his family discovered a single expended M6A3 rocket casing hidden in his attic, its steel nose cone crushed and blackened by an impact that occurred 60 years prior, a silent witness to the moment the zone of immunity was shattered forever. This individual legacy of survival is mirrored in the grander technological lineage of the M6A3, a weapon that became obsolete not because it failed, but because it succeeded so completely that it forced a total reimagining of armored warfare for the next 80 years. By 1951, the lessons learned in the Ardennes had evolved into the M20 Super Bazooka, a weapon that utilized the same 42-degree copper cone and standoff principles to penetrate 280 millimeters of armor, 3 times the capability of Morrison's rocket. The Monroe Effect, once a secret of the Aberdeen Proving Ground, became the global standard for infantry anti-tank capability, influencing the design of the Soviet RPG-7, the American M72 Law, and the Swedish AT-4, all of which are the direct descendants of the red-banded anomaly that turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. Even today, on the modern battlefields of 2025, the DNA of the M6A3 lives on in the Javelin and the N-Law, sophisticated missile systems that use tandem-shaped charges to defeat reactive armor, proving that the physics of 1944 still dictate the survival of the soldier in the foxhole. The engineering challenges that Morrison's generation solved, the precision machining of copper liners to 1/1000th of an inch, and the perfection of the hyperplastic jet, remain the fundamental building blocks of every anti-tank weapon in the world, ensuring that no matter how thick the steel or how advanced the electronics, the infantryman will always possess a variable that can liquidate the machine. The Panzer Mörder legacy is not found in the glory of the kill, but in the restoration of balance. It is the story of how innovation rewrote survival and gave the Queen of Battle her dignity back in an age of mechanical monsters. The final verdict of history is not found in the manuals or the official casualty reports of the 1,347 engagements, but in the anomaly in the foxhole, the individual soldier who, when faced with an invincible threat, finds a way to use a stream of recycled pennies and a 60-microsecond flash of synthetic lightning to say no to the meat grinder. We must remember that every piece of technology we now take for granted, from the pocket-sized law to the top-attack javelin, was born from the desperation of men like Jim Morrison and Eddie Kowalski, who stood in the freezing fog of Bastogne and pulled the trigger on a weapon that shouldn't have worked against a tank that shouldn't have died. Their sacrifice is the reason the hunter is no longer the machine, and their legacy is the capability of every soldier today to protect their brothers and return home to the silence of their own attics. As we look at the quarter-sized holes in the museum displays of captured tigers and panthers, we are seeing the physical proof of a moment when human ingenuity outpressured industrial tyranny, proving that staying alive is the most basic human instinct, and that in the hands of a determined man, a miracle of physics can change the world. The M6A3 was the ultimate variable, the straw that broke the back of the Third Reich's armored dreams, and the reason Jim Morrison could live to see his grandson graduate, even if he had to carry the smell of burnt cordite and the memory of the camera bulb flash for the rest of his life. History is made by those who refuse to be obsolete, and the Panzer Mörder will forever stand as the guardian of that cold, hard truth.